surprised. And in our country, indeed, a lot happened that has parallels with what's going on today. Mm-hmm. The ultimate, just to give a sort of sneak preview of the end of our talk, ultimately, I don't think the world has learned an awful lot.
I don't think we ever do.
But
we just make history repeat itself.
we do, and somebody made that as a famous quote. If you ignore history, what is it? How does that go? If you don't pay any attention to history, you'll repeat it.
You'll repeat it.
So
right.
Whether you want to or not.
Right.
But one of the big figures, now looking at our country, of course, was the president, and this was President Woodrow Wilson. Mm-hmm. And here's one of our first parallels. It was an election year, and a very important one, just as 2016 is. Not exactly for the same reason, but Wilson had been a professor. He was not a professional politician. But in 1912, when he was elected the first time, this was his second term, when he was elected the first time, the Republican Party was split. Does that sound
just like
anything like today?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. The Republican Party was split, and you had Theodore Roosevelt. His nose was a bit out of joint. So he made his own party. They weren't going to nominate him. They were going to re-nominate Taft. But the party was split, and Wilson won. And at that, he didn't win by an awful lot, because it was a Supreme Court judge, Charles Evans Hughes, who was running against him. Let's look at a couple of our pictures. We're going to liven up our talk. Many of these things are political cartoons, and they're very good ways of, you might say, a bump into some interesting things that were going on. You look at them as you look back.
Let's look at those pictures.
Let's take the very first one. That looks like, I'm not sure if you can read it clearly or not, but it says your rate. It's an income tax table, and this stems from the fact that in 1912 they decided they were going to have an income tax. So in 1913 they put out the first forms for tax year 1912, and this is just part of the form. But if you could see any of these, you would be absolutely appalled at you could have up to $300,000 more without having to pay any tax at all.
Okay.
And your exemptions ran. But if you can see that, at any rate, you can realize things have changed quite a bit. So that was one big thing going on at the time. And there was a big Supreme Court case having to do with Coca-Cola that came along there that sort of had something to do with the tax. But it was another one of these hair-splitting things on a definition. And we think of our Citizens United and the dreadful effects that that's having. And of course, a lot of people would say it was a dreadful effect to decide that the Supreme Court was constitutional, the income tax was constitutional. So that was a big thing, but not a world-shaking. Let's go on to the next picture. This will be the first of some pictures. Now, this is a cartoon, and here's Woodrow Wilson on the phone, and there's a poster in the background, "Vote for Wilson. He kept us out of war." And that was indeed one of the main issues, was this war going on in Europe, and how much should we take before we took action? Again, Obama, how much should he take before he does something in the Near East or somewhere else, before he pushes it? In the next picture, we see here Wilson peeking out the door, and on that dog it says Jingo. So the people who wanted war or wanted us to get into the war, or did not want us to get into the war, were somewhat at loggerheads. But this hit the newspapers, and here this dog is sitting at the door yowling, saying, "Shouldn't we do something about this?" The next picture, this illustrates some of the provocations that we had, specifically our country, because the Germans were engaging in what became known as unrestricted submarine warfare. Mm-hmm. They were not just seeking out warships of the enemies, but they were sinking unarmed merchant ships and passenger ships. And right at the beginning of 1916, they had sunk a French passenger ship. So Wilson did indeed make statements and pay attention to this. And the Germans would say, well, okay, we'll put a damper on it for the moment. But we're not making any promises. And of course, indeed, a month or so later, they would be at it again. Next picture is Wilson. Now, actually, we're going ahead a little bit here. They're anticipating 1917 when he did finally run out of patience. And you can see the thing he's holding in his hand there. It says, American ships sunk without any warning. And if we look back to almost a year before that, the Lusitania, there was a book out on that not too long ago, an excellent book. This was not an American ship, but of the 1,900 and some people aboard, including crew, 160 or so were Americans. And not very many survived. 124 were drowned in that disaster. So this illustrates that, well, finally, public pressure and so on, and just the horror of it all, had gotten through to Wilson. Now, speaking of the horror of it all, something we today is this dreadful, these horrible beheadings and so on in the Near East. So we have that in the background of our psyche here, and we're not directly doing anything about it. It's not happening to us directly, but it was the same then, these deaths and so on. But then they began to happen directly to us in a short period of time. If we proceed to the next picture, please. We illustrate here one of the big issues of the day, and this was the vote for women. And a good many of the states, I think upward of half the states, had already passed laws, so women were already voting. And there was a huge turnout that year, and one is expected this year, in view of the issues involved, and then because women could vote, if everybody did. This lady in the cartoon here, it's demonstrating things that they're saying women are going to bring to government. If you let women in the government, there's going to be a lot broader approach to solutions and to things to do. One more on women comes next. And this one, Simple Simon met a pieman coming to the fair. So here's this lady selling little cakes, and these little cakes are participation, of course, justice for women. Most people agreed with it, as a matter of fact, and it finally went through. So there was one big issue. The big issue for women today is the pay issue.
Yes.
And that you hear very often in the news now. So you had women still not home free on this whole situation, but there has been a little progress in that over 100 years, but not 100%. Proceeding now to another one of the main issues, the next picture, we will see a campaign train, and this is very different from the old, from modern. This happened to be Charles Evans Hughes. He was the Supreme Court Justice, Republican, running against Wilson. And you had, I remember when Truman was running, there were scenes on the back of trains.
On the back
remember
of the
they didn't have this slick business they have now. But there's, and this is, interestingly enough, was a bunch of women that were out in favor of Charles Evans Hughes, who was quite a well-known conservative at that point. So proceeding another one, we'll find another one for our, I think our next one is, next picture, yes, is going to be another cartoon. And this one is very biting for the Republican Party. You can see GOP there, and an elephant lying in bed looking just about gone. And the country trying to keep it going, the two-party system going. But the Republican Party really was on the skids at that point, as it is in some respects now. And again, this crucial issue of division of parties that we haven't always had. I mean, go back even to Reagan's reign, things were not like that.
Right.
And as you go farther back, even Eisenhower could get things done with Democrats on the other side. But this sort of thing, this was in place of all the television shows and the things we see. And in its own way, I think it's more effective. than a lot of people standing up there calling each other names. They did that too, but in print. But to continue now with another one here, we will see. This represents Teddy Roosevelt.
Right. And
Teddy was the prime mover in the split in 1912, because as we mentioned, he has they didn't put him up for candidate, so he formed his own party. It's known as the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party. So Teddy, they were urging him to run in 1916. We'll have two candidates. We'll have you and we'll have Charles Evans Hughes, and everybody will like you. And Teddy had certain elements of the Donald Trump in him.
Yes, he did.
The épatez le bourgeois, just insult anybody. Not quite as bad maybe, but Teddy, interestingly enough, refused to be a candidate because he said that will hand the election to the Democrats. And the Republicans apparently didn't pay attention to that because they've done the same thing. And I think possibly that's what they're going to do. But that remains to be seen. But we'll find out. There were also some disagreements having to do with some little wars that cropped up. Now, Wilson did not want to get into the European War, and I think the majority still did not really want to. But in January, there was a revolution going on in Mexico, right here on our border, Pancho Villa.
Yes.
And I once turned in the middle of an old movie where Wallace Beery was playing Pancho Villa. But what they did was capture, 15, 16 American mining engineers who were down there on or near the border, New Mexico, and they wound up being shot. They wound up shooting them. And not long after that, a month or two later, as spring came on, there was a raiding party, several hundred from Mexico into Columbus, New Mexico there. Of course, the name New Mexico tells you something there too, right. Part of their problems. But they killed a number of people, a dozen or two people down there. And there must have been a local cavalry base because they were driven out by the 13th Cavalry back into Mexico and pursued. And Washington assigned General Pershing with 2 more regiments of cavalry to go down there and really get rid of them. So here was this vest pocket war going on down here, undeclared, but a war going on down there. And there's the war in Europe, and people are juggling here and there. But the most interesting thing to me about the Mexican War was the fact that it was the first time we used air power at all.
Oh.
The Aero Squadron in the Army provided a couple of old Jennies, the old Jenny, Curtis Jenny. Right. They went down there and did reconnaissance. So a little bit of history there, the first time they were really probably used in that. There were violent episodes in the United States. Let's go on to the next picture. I think the next group is, yes, the next group is racial difficulties. We've overcome some of that, but not enough by all means. But this one, the Chinese, look, that Chinese must go. And the Chinese had been brought to this country and worked on the railroads. But still, in 1916, some people wanted to get rid of the Chinese. And so you had cartoons like this popping up, send them back. Of course, compared with today, this is vastly different. There are people who say the Chinese are getting the better of us business-wise and so on. But there's none of this just purely on the base of racial.
Race, yeah.
And they joke about the Chinese laundry. Well, the next picture shows another thing, the Mexican picture. And this is one, Wilson is the cook there, pouring pepper on the doings down on the border. So some people did notice and some people did disagree. But I don't know what they thought should be done. Perhaps they were angry at him because he hadn't protested shooting these engineers. Who knows, the engineers might have been doing something they shouldn't do, but we can't tell without really doing a lot of research at this point. But you had this also happening at the same time in that century. And think of today, we have little difficulties going on. There was some adventurism because Wilson sent troops into some South American countries. Why did he do that? Because the German ships were prowling at one point off our Carolina coast.
Oh, yes.
And there was all this talk, and people with a German last name were having a problem, some serious, cruelty against them.
That was probably the time some of the German names were changed to more of an American style.
Indeed, it was. Mm-hmm. But he was carrying on the war there at the same time that he was trying to hold the line and not carry it on in Europe. So there was some disagreement there, and there was violence, as I say, within our country. There were some ghastly lynchings going on. There was a big one in Texas that made the world press, I think. But there were also like terrorist acts. There was an explosion in the middle of the year. There was an explosion in San Francisco where a parade was being held for these people who were against militarism, by these people who were against militarism, and a couple dozen people were killed. And meanwhile, here on the East Coast in New Jersey, German spies blew up a munitions dump with a large explosion, and some people were killed again. And we don't, always take full account of these things that were going on. So this is happening today, but it was happening in the good old days as well. And there's one more picture, I think, in that connection, and we want to look at that. And this has to do, several things over the past year or so have regarded police actions that were not right against minorities, often against African Americans, which was just grossly unfair. And here you have a picture. We haven't solved that problem as yet. We had the problem in 1916, where they're saying these poor policemen minding their own business were attacked by this great, huge giant of a man, and they had to bring him in. Well, we have proceeded, and I think we're thinking better now, but we still have some problems that go back to that period, from that period. Now let's just keep on with pictures while we're at it here. I think we might. The final one here on the immigration question is literacy test. And this touches a nerve. This doesn't say, keep all the foreigners out. It just says, Uncle Sam is up there saying, if you can pass a literacy test, you're in. And there's a lot to that. One of the major complaints now against, and many, particularly the Mexicans, who are illegal and who can't, or other Spanish speakers who never learn English. But the problem was there then. And I don't know, you say, well, there's a solution, have people pass more tests, but how can you do that with illegal?
Exactly.
You can't do it. And it points up that this problem is one we might not be going to solve soon, but at least we're trying. And at least the press in those days was drawing the problem to the attention of the American public, for whatever good that it might have been. Now, in Europe, 1916 was a busy year, too. It was the second full year of the war. 1915 had been a little more for the Germans, at least in the air. It was becoming an air war. Things were developing. Their aviation was developing, unfortunately, in the destructive direction, but improving on flight as well. But the Germans mounted a big offensive, and they went after mainly Verdun, in the north of the line there with France. It was a pretty beastly thing, and the French had all they could do to try to defend it. The British came along in summer and mounted another one to try to divert that, and on the Somme River to the south. And what happened was that it did not completely relieve the pressure on Verdun. And the fighting was awful, and the trench warfare just got worse and worse and worse, and the air warfare got worse. But by the end of the year, there really was no improvement. In fact, they were back to the line. Our allies were back to the line they had started from. And they continued to get supplies from us. The Germans, of course, didn't like that. The Germans continued their warfare. The Germans began bombing more. They started bombing in 1915, and they kept up. There was even a plan to try to bomb New York, to get a suicide mission, of course, but to figure out some way where either an airship or an airplane. The ship would have been easier because of more capacity, for gas and for weapons. But this was all going on in the background. And eventually, as that cartoon showed there, Wilson, with all these offenses in hand, says, well, I'll go to Congress and I'll see if they want to have a war, if they want to declare war. And he does, and they do. And only one person votes against hostilities. And this is 1917. It's gone a little beyond the year you're in. But Jeanette Rankin, I think she was the only woman in Congress as well, had voted against it. So the United States began to gear up that next year. But Wilson was already thinking about afterward, and he was a very paternalistic sort of person. Could we hear the clip, please? Listen to this closely, and you will hear that he is very paternalistic and not too definite in some things. And he was also
dark pages in the history of the white man's dealings with the Indian, and many parts of the record are stained with the greed and avarice of those who have thought only of their own profit. But it is also true that the purposes and motives of this great government and of our nation as a whole toward the red men have been wise, just, and beneficent. The remarkable progress of our Indian brothers toward civilization is proof of it, and open to all to see. During the past half-century, you have seen the schoolhouse take the place of the military post on your reservations. The administration of Indian affairs has been transferred from the military to the civil arm of the government. The education and industrial training the government has given you has enabled thousands of Indian men and women to take their places in civilization alongside their white neighbors. Thousands are living in substantial farmhouses on their own separate allotments of land. Hundreds of others have won places of prominence in the professions, and some have worked their way into the halls of Congress and into places of responsibility in our state and national governments. 30,000 Indian children are enrolled in government, state, and mission schools. The great white father now calls you his brothers, not his children, because you have shown in your education and in your settled ways of life staunch, manly, worthy qualities of sound character.
All right, good. I guess we've heard that. Wilson was inclined to be very paternalistic. He was also liberal. He wanted to do some reform of labor laws. I think he had a sort of protective feeling, which caused it to be, which caused him to be unfair some of the time, because too much protection is not what you want. But he was in favor of, for example, he want the 8-hour day. He was very much in favor of that. But it was rejected by the Republicans because they said it would be bad for business. And this draws a line between then and now, because look at Flint, Michigan. There was administration. It happened to be, this was Republicans again, but it happened that they were, they resisted keeping on with their old water system and going to the less expensive one that was harmful.
Right.
So this paternalism could lead to things that weren't always too great.
Right.
Wilson, I'm surprised that, in looking over some of the publicity, they did not get after him about his remarriage. He was married, very happily married for umpty years, up to into middle age. But his wife died just about the time he became president. And apparently he was very, very distraught. and was thinking of resigning and doing all sorts of things. But he was persuaded to, hang on. And before too long, he married, it was a British woman. Her name was Edith. And I guess she did a lot of the hard work. Later on, as his health deteriorated, she kept him going and made some decisions herself. But I have not seen any references to that snide or below the belt or anything. And that's interesting, because nowadays, Donald Trump anyway gets away with some awfully snide family references.
Right.
One wonders about that. But Wilson, now, going back before war was declared, at the end of 1916, he was getting more and more worried, because he went for these little adventures in South America that I had mentioned briefly. He sent Marines into Santo Domingo out of fear of German spies, German bases maybe being set up there. And nowadays, of course, we think of the Russian bases in Cuba, right, and how Kennedy had to cope with that. Wilson didn't have to cope with any actual bases that we know of. But in Haiti, he also did the same thing. He had marched the Marines into Haiti, and they stayed there for a number of years. The Navy took over in Santo Domingo, and they were there till 1924. And again, a business creeps into this a little bit, because by controlling the country, they, of course, could control a
lot of the business.
Throw the business that way and profit by the natural resources down there.
Well, we're down to the last couple of minutes.
Last couple of minutes. Well, I think it's an interesting thing always to look back, and when you can find this many parallels, you wonder a little about the psychology of the country now and then. I think it's quite different now. It's maybe a little more, don't worry about it kind of thing. We see it happening. We see it on television. We get used to it.
Yeah, we get a little calloused.
We get calloused to it, and we're afraid to take action for one reason or another, or we go to the opposite extreme and say, get in there and bash them. I know McCain, for example, was saying, we've got it right away in Syria. And who knows, maybe it was the right thing to do. Maybe Wilson was right to get in and
okay, what kind of diversions did we have there then that we're having now?
Diversions?
Diversions, well, like, World Series and that kind of thing.
Entertainment.
Yes.
Well, we did have a World Series. That was already going, you see. And the Boston Red Sox won. And apparently they didn't have wasn't it just a few years ago they were in the running, and somebody said they hadn't won one since World War I or something. Anyway, they beat the Brooklyn Robins.
The Robins?
Robins, 4-1.
Okay.
But you also had a wonderful cultural scene. Well, the rest of sports was pretty well out of it, the international things, because of the war in Europe. But the entertainment scene, the Ballet Russe, the famous Ballet Russe, was on in Europe at that point. And they came over when they came for their American tour, of course, they had to take a ship. And they risked the ocean, the sea warfare, submarine warfare going on. But they came over, and they had one good season and one fair season over here. But all these things were impacted by the war. But Wilson, I don't know how much a person he was for that sort of thing, whether he threw out the first ball. That would be an interesting question. Maybe somebody knows.
Maybe somebody knows. Did Wilson ever throw out a first ball? I think we're going to have to end on that, Jane. But it's interesting to see the parallels 100 years apart, that we seem to relive and make the same mistakes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And
despite our great technical, everything is computer now and takes as long as it ever did.
Yes, and you'd think that as open as we are and as vocal as we are, that there would be changes, but it does seem to kind of repeat itself, which is sad. Maybe we need to learn something.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see what we have in the way of announcements here.